Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. Join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Today we want to look at one of the components when people come to me and they say, what is really going on in your mentoring program? What are you really focusing on with your clients? And I always point to three things. The first thing is we want to work on you adopting the right mindset, the mindset that you are in charge in creating your own future. That's one thing. The second thing, obviously, that we want to focus on is to start looking and finding suitable investment properties so that you can start your journey towards the time freedom point. And the third thing is to set up the structures that put you basically in charge of your investing empire. And I always recommend to start this by forming a company that has the explicit purpose for you to become your company to manage all your investing stuff. And part of that, setting this kind of structure up, and by the way, all these three things are starting and working in parallel. The focus might shift. At some point, we focus initially more on finding the first property. Then we might be also in parallel working a little bit on mindset every other session. And then we work on structure maybe once a month or every quarter or something like that. Because our mentoring is obviously a long-time relationship. We're working together for a year for like 25, 26 sessions, and if you like, even longer than that. So it's not all happening all at once, but it's also not sequential. We have these three pillars and we're working on them somewhat in parallel. And one of these things, when you look at it as you are the king, the queen, the manager, the CEO of your investing company, then the question is, how do I grow and establish my company? And as any other company, you would have people working for you. Now, they don't necessarily have to be employees. What we're talking about in our investing for real estate is that you have entities working for you, like the bank or the lender that gives you the mortgage, or the insurance company broker who makes sure that you have the right insurance for the property and the right deductible and those kind of things. And one of those, especially when we're talking about residential real estate investing out of state, is that you need some sort of property management. Either you get that because you have it from the turnkey provider that you buy your properties from, which I'm helping you to find, or you go out and you have a property, whether you got it from a turnkey provider or otherwise, and you want it to get managed. And so the question is, okay, who do you work with? Now, in the bigger picture, I want to give you a little bit of an idea how big this whole property management situation is. The question that I saw in an article is, what's next for the $37 billion market in property management? And what I found when I did a little bit of research is, and I've reported about this before, is that more and more people, especially in the millennial generation, see it as very unlikely or very, very hard for them to ever really become property owners or homeowners. And this is especially true for any people who live in large metropolitan areas or kind of expensive states. Like in California, if you think about most locations within about 20 to 30 miles off the coast of California, and the same is true all the way up to Vancouver in Canada, properties there are like $500,000, $700,000, $900,000 for something very modest. So for somebody coming out of college to ever imagine that they would have enough down payment to afford something like that, if they don't inherit it, is very unlikely. And the same is true, by the way, in New York or in Boston or places on the East Coast. So a lot of people of the younger generation say, well, I'm pretty sure that I will be renting forever, which means these properties that they're renting, whether it's apartments or single family or duplex, triplex, anything like that, needs to be managed. And very few owners want to manage themselves these days. So then the other thing is, why would property management companies growing and having more demand is because in the past, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, people who were able to buy properties, the so-called mom and pop property managers, they are now all getting into retirement age. And they don't want to do it anymore. They might want to keep their properties, but then turn over management to professional property managers. And some of them say, well, I bought these properties, so ultimately I can retire. And they sell the properties to other investors who then also want to have property management. The other thing that has happened, if you think about it, between 2008 and basically 2019, because of the big financial crisis, there were a lot of additional rules put in place that meant that construction companies were very hesitant to invest and build new housing. And that was true especially for single family, but also for apartment complexes. And only in the last few years has construction for apartment complexes started again, especially in certain locations like Austin, Texas, and certain places like Miami and so forth. So any one of those larger apartment complexes obviously needs property management. Then we shouldn't forget, and I don't want to make this in any way political, but the best estimates that I have seen say that in the last 10 years, something like 11 million people have come across the border as immigrants. Now, whether they're illegal or not, whether they should be sent back or whatever, doesn't matter. Right now, they're in the country, and this is 11 million extra people that need a place to stay, right? And so most of these places that they would be staying, they wouldn't own themselves, and they would probably not be super, super high-end places. So most likely those places will also be managed by property management. And this could be that cities or counties are actually hiring property management to take care of this influx of migrants. And then there is the last thing that I would say that is also to be considered is people are getting older, but we have to keep in mind that the real strong economic growth that has happened in past generation happened in the 60s and 70s, and then there was super high inflation in the 80s, early 90s, and then we had really good growth again in the 90s and early 2000s until the dot-com bubble burst. And you could even make an argument between like 2005 and 2010 was pretty good growth. But if you look at these growth spurts, the people that took advantage and could take advantage of them are people that are now getting into their 80s and 90s and even older than that. And so when they die, then their children are inheriting these properties, and oftentimes these properties might be far away from where the children live. So if they want to keep the property, which is nice if you inherit a house or several, and you want to keep them, I would always recommend to keep them because they probably have no mortgages anymore, and you could rent them out and maybe spruce them up a little bit to get better rent. But then if you live, like, let's say, somewhere in Kansas and you inherit a property in Memphis, well, you wouldn't want to manage it from Kansas. So what are you going to do? You're basically going to find property management. This 37 billion market of property management, those are the reasons why it will have continuously growing demand in the future. How they actually going to handle the demand is anybody's guess. I hope very much personally that they will come up with better tools so that this triangle that exists, which is interesting for us if you're listening to the show because you are and want to become a real estate investor. We have this triangle. We are the owners. Then we have tenants that generate our positive cash flow if everything works well. And then we have property management. And the tenants obviously get the contract from property management. They report any maintenance issues to property management. Property management collects the rent, all those kind of things. But they also only have somebody that gives them work if they work with the owners, which is us, the investor. And that makes that triangle. And I would hope that the improvement on what is going on with work orders, how is a property management company organized, get regular updates on how the property that you own actually looks like, and provided those updates, those pictures or videos or whatever is possible from property management, so you don't get surprises that your property that you thought was operating well gets destroyed by the tenants, and after 2 or 3 years of living there you have insane amounts of maintenance costs to get it back together and rent it again. So those kind of things I hope will improve, but the market is massive. And the need for shelter, the need for housing is never going to go away. So it's going to be good times for property management companies in the future. The only thing that I believe could maybe change that is when any of these companies go crazy and start asking for too much for their work. Right now it's typical 8 to 10% of the rent income for long-term rentals and up to about 25% for short-term rentals. If that were to dramatically change, then I think people will be probably saying, well, then I try to find an alternative or sell the property or manage it myself. But as long as property management companies stay reasonable with their request for fees, it is very likely that they will have a very prosperous future. So I hope that was interesting for you and educational. And we talk about it again to see if the prediction that I made is correct. So with that, be well and stay safe, and I talk to you tomorrow.